The most terrifying aspect of the eternal struggle is not the threat of yielding to the absolute void, but the unshakable certainty of a triumph that leaves nothing behind to cherish. In the grand, silent calculations of the celestial architecture, mortal existence is merely a currency, a fleeting resource to be expended with calculated indifference by the silent gods who observe from the unseen heavens. We speak of glory as if it were a physical monolith, an edifice of golden light that can be worn as a badge of honor. But in truth, glory is merely the radioactive ash settling upon 1,000 shattered worlds. It is the heavy, suffocating mantle of survival worn by those who have forgotten the warmth of the sun. The grand paradox of guardianship lies in the realization that supreme brilliance in strategy is often the very catalyst that dooms the protected to an endless cycle of grueling trials. The shepherd, by virtue of his perfection in guiding the flock, merely ensures they walk a longer, more agonizing path toward the inevitable harvest. At what point does the guardian become the harbinger of ruin? Simply by leading the faithful through the relentless tempest for 10,000 consecutive days. This is the undeniable truth of the cosmos. Victory is an illusion crafted by the desperate. Every successful campaign, every masterstroke of tactical genius, merely postpones the final sanction while increasing the ultimate cost of existence. The euphoria of the doomed is a fleeting chemical reaction, a brief respite before the encroaching shadows demand their inevitable tithe. We build our citadels not to touch the heavens, but to hide from the gaze of the absolute. We forge our weapons not to secure peace, but to dictate the terms of our own unmaking. The silent gods do not weep for the fallen. They merely calculate the remaining mass of the faithful. To exist in this era is to accept that every breath is borrowed, and every heartbeat is a countdown to the great cleansing. For Strategos Malakai, this philosophical paradox was not a mere exercise of the intellect, but a jagged splinter driven deep into the fragile reliquary of his psyche. He was the architect of the Pyrrhic Line, the master director of a cosmic theater where the only currency was the vital essence of the unformed generation. His domain was the Iron-Ridge sector, a vast, unbroken belt of industrial fortress worlds where the natural crust of the planets had long been entirely replaced by overlapping layers of reinforced steel, adamantium plating, and mountains of toxic slag. Here, there was no soil to nurture seeds of hope, only endless plains of cold metal and labyrinthine macro-bunkers that plunged into the dark depths of the planetary core. It was a realm built upon the absolute dedication to martial supremacy, an apparatus of survival that required the complete subjugation of the individual will to the collective necessity. The environment of the Iron Ridge was a chemical nightmare, a brutal testament to the hubris of mortal engineering. Corrosive rains cascaded from the permanently obscured heavens, a relentless deluge that melted the seals on the respirators of the laboring masses and etched weeping scars into the colossal statues of ancient, forgotten heroes. The atmosphere itself was a heavy, suffocating veil, so utterly saturated with heavy metals and industrial exhaust that every drawn breath felt like inhaling a tempest of iron needles. Above, the sky was a permanent, choking shroud of gray smog, a thick canopy that forever hid the stars and denied the inhabitants any glimpse of the celestial bodies. they ostensibly fought to protect. To gaze upward was to invite a profound melancholy, a realization of the absolute desolation that surrounded them, a reminder that the universe above was indifferent to their endless toil. Within this brutalist nightmare of endless smokestacks that vomited black bile into the toxic heavens, millions of aspirants existed in conditions of absolute, crushing darkness. They were the cogs in a macro machine that possessed no empathy, a leviathan of industry that demanded constant motion and unrelenting zealotry. Factories the size of sprawling continents churned out millions of armaments per solar cycle. The rhythmic grinding of monolithic gears and the thunderous hiss of ancient pistons formed a ceaseless, deafening liturgy to the divine machine spirit. This was a sanctuary of unending toil, where the ritual of labor was the highest form of worship, and the exhaustion of the physical form was the ultimate, necessary offering. To keep the engines of resistance turning, there was no joy in this creation, only the grim satisfaction of a quota met, a temporary stay of execution, for a world perpetually on the brink of collapse. The Iron-Ridge sector did not merely manufacture the instruments of unmaking. It produced the very shields of flesh and bone required to hold the encroaching dark at bay. It was the beating, iron heart of the regional defense effort. Without its staggering output of monolithic weaponry and its endless tithe of expendable neophytes, 3 neighboring sectors would inevitably succumb to the creeping shadows within a single solar decade. Thus, the relentless sacrifice was consecrated. The grinding of the machines, a symphony of forgotten purpose, echoed through the vast empty halls of the macro bunkers, a constant reminder that the individual was nothing more than a temporary vessel, a fleeting spark designed to be extinguished in the grander equation of survival. They were born into the smog, they toiled in the darkness, and they marched into the fires of the void. Their lives measured not in years, but in the fractions of a second they could delay the inevitable. High above the churning oceans of industry, encased within a subterranean citadel of unparalleled fortification, sat Strategos Malakai. The command bunker was a sanctuary of cold, clinical isolation. A wide, overhead tactical hologram table dominated the center of the chamber, casting a flickering, ghostly blue light onto the weathered, iron-hard features of the Strategos. The luminescence carved deep shadows into his visage, revealing a face that appeared less like a human countenance and more like a barren landscape of ancient ruins, weathered by millennia of silent storms. Outside the heavily armored bulkheads of his sanctum, the rhythmic thumping of the heavy artillery, the relentless drumbeat of the crimson toll, vibrated through the very bedrock. Dust drifted from the vaulted ceiling like a slow, agonizing countdown of his remaining sanity. Malakai possessed a curse masquerading as a miraculous gift, the infallible memory. His mind was a vast, inescapable archive, a flawless reliquary of every action, every consequence, and every sacrifice. He could recall with terrifying clarity the face, the designation, and the trembling breath of every single neophyte he had ever assigned to a position of no return. The trauma he bore was not a sudden, explosive rupture of the mind, but the cumulative, crushing weight of individual tragedies merging into a singular, agonizing interrogation of his own soul. He did not suffer from the comforting oblivion of madness. Rather, he was tormented by an excess of perfect, crystalline sanity in an undeniably irrational cosmos. He saw the threads of fate, and he knew exactly how many had to be severed to maintain the tapestry. His hands, steady and resolute, were forever stained with the indelible phantom grime of 100 distant trenches. As he stood before the colossal tactical cogitator, he moved a glowing, ethereal rune across the holographic projection. With a mere flick of his finger, a designation representing 10,000 of the unformed generation was shifted into a zone of absolute mathematical unmaking. The ambient soundscape within the bunker transitioned smoothly from the muffled, distant thunder of macro cannons to the sharp, agonizingly clear sound of a single ancient stylus scratching across a parchment of casualty projections. It was a sound devoid of passion, yet dripping with the silent weeping of an entire generation. Every stroke of the pen was a monument to the fallen, a silent consecration of their vital essence to the altar of the defense. He understood the brutal mathematics of existence with flawless precision. To secure the sector, to consecrate the perimeter against the encroaching void, he must continually expunge the very generation he was sworn to guard. This absolute clarity was the architecture of his damnation. Malakai viewed himself not as a savior, but as a necessary leviathan, a being who had systematically traded his capacity for mortal empathy for the chilling ability to calculate the decimation of his own legions. With the absolute precision of a mechanical automata, the paradox of his existence was an inescapable labyrinth. He was the master of the defense, yet the greatest purveyor of the crimson toll. He was the architect of their survival and the author of their ultimate erasure. Beyond the suffocating smog of the Iron-Ridge, traversing the cold, silent expanses of the stellar void, a new shadow was beginning to eclipse the distant nebulae. It was not an enemy that could be reasoned with, nor a political entity seeking the subjugation of territories. It was the swarm mind of Hive Fleet Gorgon, an apex anomaly of the cosmos, a biological tide of unfathomable scale. This cosmic horror possessed no diplomacy, no grand ideology, and no mercy. It was an unthinking, relentless hunger, a vast, interconnected network of biological leviathans driven solely by the imperative to devour the vital essence of all organized matter. It was the ultimate manifestation of the cosmic void, seeking to unravel the very tapestry of existence and absorb its disparate threads into a singular, horrific unity. The approach of the swarm mind was heralded not by declarations of war, but by a creeping, insidious desolation. It was a plague of the soul as much as the flesh. Long before the first physical contact, the psychic weight of the approaching hive cast a pall of deep melancholy over the Iron-Ridge. Seers and astropaths within the citadel's highest spires wept tears of black fluid as they gazed into the ether, their minds unraveling before the sheer, incomprehensible magnitude of the biological tide. The swarm mind sought to transform the very environment against the defenders, an evolutionary cull that would clog the atmospheric filters with toxic spores, and repurpose the fallen organic chassis of the defenders into new, horrific instruments of the unending harvest. It was a creeping rot that promised to silence the monolithic factories and plunge the fortress worlds into an eternal, organic quiet. For Malakai, The encroaching shadow of Gorgon represented the ultimate, uncompromising equation of attrition. It was a force that could not be outmaneuvered by conventional brilliance, only delayed through the meticulous, agonizing expenditure of his own defensive lines. The great cleansing of the sector's resources would need to be accelerated to an unprecedented scale. As he stared deep into the holographic representation of the approaching doom, the deep furrows of exhaustion on his face seemed to solidify into a mask of pure, unyielding resolve. The desire to simply fail, to let the machinery of war grind to a final, merciful halt, whispered seductively in the darkest corners of his mind. If he faltered, the tragedy would finally conclude. But the iron grip of his duty, the unyielding hubris of a master strategist, bound him to the console. He would continue to vanquish the darkness. He would continue to orchestrate the crimson toll, and he would willingly feed his own soul to the fires of the grand apparatus to ensure the temporary survival of the Iron-Ridge. The first maneuvers had already begun, and the heavens wept toxic tears in anticipation of the unmaking to come. The deployment of the 402nd Iron-Ridge Militia was not a martial maneuver, but a massive, coordinated ritual of systematic unmaking. They were the unformed generation, a boundless ocean of neophytes hastily clad in the heavy, Baroque plating of their ancestors, shoved into the deepest subsurface trenches to serve as the ultimate physical barrier against the approaching biological tide. To observe their descent into the suffocating depths of the front line was to witness a grand procession of the condemned, marching with silent zealotry toward an absolute certainty. The atmosphere within the trenches was a thick, corrosive miasma, a toxic soup of industrial runoff, and the encroaching spore clouds that rapidly dissolved the protective seals of their armor. Their individual lives were no longer measured by the passage of celestial bodies, but by the agonizingly brief minutes they could withstand the environmental degradation before their organic chassis failed entirely. They were the meat shield, the expendable foundation of crushed bone and rusted iron, upon which Strategos Malakai was forced to build his desperate citadel of resistance. When the swarm mind of Hive Fleet Gorgon finally breached the outer perimeter, there was no chaotic cacophony of traditional warfare, only the horrifyingly efficient sound of a great reaping. The biological leviathans of the xenos tide did not strike with malice. They simply overwhelmed the defenders with the cold, unyielding pressure of a collapsing monolith. The collision between the fragile resolve of the 402nd and the infinite hunger of the swarm was a spectacle of absolute desolation. The vital essence of the neophytes was rapidly harvested, their defensive formations systematically unraveled by the sheer, crushing mass of the alien entity. The front lines became a swirling vortex of eradication, where the armor configurations of the defenders were violently destabilized, and the glowing life runes on their chest plates were extinguished in catastrophic unison. It was an evolutionary coal of unprecedented scale, an unmaking of the human form that left nothing but the silent echoes of their sacrifice in the mud. High within his isolated reliquary of command, Strategos Malakai bore witness to this grand purge through the flickering luminescence of the tactical cogitator. Every extinguished rune on the holographic display was a physical blow to his mind, a sharp, searing pain that resonated through his infallible memory. He knew their faces. He remembered the specific, terrified cadence of their breathing as they had recited the final litanies of devotion. The absolute, mathematical perfection of the defense was holding, but the cost was a continuous, staggering expenditure of the sector's soul. He was trading continents of vital essence for mere kilometers of irradiated slag. The melancholy of his position threatened to crush him completely. He was the orchestrator of their doom, functioning exactly as the grand apparatus of the High Lords required. His mind was a labyrinth of inescapable guilt, a cage where his brilliance only served to illuminate the terrifying scale of the required sacrifice. It was within this suffocating atmosphere of glorious despair that the catalyst of his ultimate damnation manifested. From the shadowed alcoves of the command bunker emerged Tech Priest Manipulus She-7, a terrifying amalgamation of ancient theology and relentless biomechanical integration. The Tech Priest moved with the silent, frictionless grace of an apex automata, his physical form long ago purged of the frailties of the mortal coil. Copper wiring and glowing, synthetic ocular units had replaced the weeping eyes of humanity. She-7 did not observe the holographic carnage with sorrow, but with the cold, calculating reverence of a disciple, witnessing a flawless equation resolving itself in real time. He recognized the crushing weight upon the Strategos, the dangerous friction generated by a human heart trapped within the gears of a cosmic meat grinder. The mechanical entity offered a solution, a whispered promise of salvation, delivered in a voice that resembled the grinding of tectonic plates. She-7 proposed the ultimate ascension, a permanent, neurological integration of Malakai's mind directly into the planetary cogitator matrix. It was an offer to shed the heavy, agonizing burden of empathy. By bridging his consciousness with the divine machine spirit, Malakai could eradicate the pain of his infallible memory. The faces of the fallen would no longer haunt his waking hours. They would merely become statistical data points, variables in an endless, emotionless equation of survival. The Tech Priest framed this unmaking of the human soul not as a tragedy, but as a necessary consecration, the final evolution required to perfectly combat a threat that possessed no capacity for psychological exhaustion. To defeat a mindless swarm, one must become an equally cold, unyielding monolith of calculation. The philosophical weight of this temptation was a staggering force. Malakai stood at the precipice of a terrifying metamorphosis. To accept the integration was to achieve the ultimate strategic perfection, to become a god of war, devoid of the weakness of remorse. But it also meant abandoning the very humanity he was ostensibly sacrificing millions to protect. The paradox twisted in his mind like a serrated blade. If he became an unfeeling machine, was the victory even worth achieving? What was the purpose of saving the Iron-Ridge sector if its guardian was no more than an automated conduit for destruction? Yet, as he watched another block of 10,000 runes flicker and vanish into the digital void, the agony of his current existence seemed infinitely worse than the cold, silent emptiness promised by the Tech Priest. The temptation to simply stop feeling the profound desolation was an intoxicating poison. Driven by a desperate final surge of mortal hubris, Strategos Malakai rejected the immediate integration, choosing instead to orchestrate a masterstroke that would prove his humanity could still triumph without the sacrifice of his soul. He conceived a tactical maneuver of unparalleled audacity, a labyrinthine deception designed to lure the primary synapse node of the Tyranid vanguard into an absolute, inescapable kill zone. It was a gambit that required the microscopic synchronization of planetary artillery, atmospheric manipulation, and the precise baiting retreat of the shattered remnants of the 402nd Militia. For 72 agonizing hours, Malakai conducted this grand symphony of ruin, pushing his fragile mind to the absolute zenith of strategic clairvoyance. He manipulated the biological tide, drawing the unthinking mass deeper into a canyon of sheer, rusted adamantium, completely surrounding them with the silent, dormant muzzles of the sector's most devastating macro-weaponry. When the trap finally snapped shut, it was a moment of terrifying majesty. The heavens themselves seemed to tear open as 1,000 orbital strikes, and subterranean macro-cannons unleashed their synchronized fury upon the xenos swarm. The resulting devastation was not merely a physical purge, but a fundamental unraveling of the enemy's biological architecture. The primary node of the swarm mind was instantly vaporized, the immense psychic backlash sending a shockwave of paralysis through the surrounding alien ranks. For a brief, shining moment, the relentless pressure on the front line ceased. The surviving neophytes of the 402nd stood amidst the smoking, irradiated ruins of their foes, their armored chassis battered but unbroken. The holographic table in the command bunker flared with a brilliant, triumphant green. The impossible had been achieved. A monumental victory had been secured with an expenditure of vital essence far below the acceptable calculated threshold. In the cold silence of his sanctum, Strategos Malakai allowed himself a single, shallow breath of profound relief. The cycle of the crimson toll appeared momentarily to be broken. The sheer, overwhelming euphoria of the doomed washed over him, a fleeting, intoxicating validation of his brilliant, tortured mind. He had stared into the maw of the absolute void and forced it to blink. He had saved the unformed generation from the great reaping, proving that the brutal mathematics of the universe could be subverted by the sheer force of human will. The silent gods had been defied. But the universe does not reward defiance. It merely recalibrates its vengeance. The golden falsehood of his triumph shattered precisely 3 minutes later. The astropathic choir deep within the citadel erupted into simultaneous agonizing screams, their minds overwhelmed by a new transmission from the high command of the segmentum. The directive was not one of commendation, but of absolute, chilling pragmatism. The segmentum lords had monitored Malakai's flawless victory. They recognized the strategic value of the paralyzed swarm and the geographical advantage of the kill zone. The order was uncompromising. The victorious 402nd Militia were not to be extracted. The command to hold the line, transmitted across the stellar void from the untouchable, silent gods of the segmentum hierarchy, was an unyielding edict that fundamentally altered the fabric of the cosmos for the defenders. The surviving neophytes of the 402nd, still riding the fleeting, intoxicating chemical wave of their impossible, miraculous triumph, found themselves entirely and utterly forsaken by the very heavens they had bled to secure. The second biological tide, a leviathan of shadows so impossibly dense it possessed its own gravitational field of pure despair, descended upon the sector like a shroud of ultimate unmaking. The vital essence of the militia, the very souls he had just miraculously pulled from the maw of the abyss through sheer force of will, was now being harvested with terrifying, unthinking mechanical efficiency. The psychological agony of this supreme betrayal was a highly concentrated spiritual acid that violently dissolved the remaining core of his humanity. The cruel paradox of the successful failure had finally reached its absolute zenith. Malakai had achieved the absolute pinnacle of strategic perfection, only to realize with crushing clarity that perfection in this Grimdark era was merely the most efficient method of feeding the insatiable cosmic meat grinder. In the deepest, darkest abyss of this glorious despair, the elongated, unnatural shadow of Tech Priest Manipulus She-7 stretched across the flickering, sickly blue light of the tactical cogitator. The offer of absolute neurological integration, the permanent, irrevocable severing of the mortal coil, and the ascension into the divine binary was extended once more into the silence of the bunker. This time, standing amidst the ruins of his own sanity, Strategos Malakai did not resist. The human heart, battered and ground into a shapeless mass, finally surrendered to the cold, undeniable sanctuary of the machine. Deep within the most heavily shielded vaults, stripped of his Baroque armor, and bathed in the harsh, clinical luminescence of the Mechanicus surgical reliquary, the Strategos was rigidly bound to the colossal ascension apparatus. Serpentine cables of living copper and sanctified iron were driven deep into his cranial structure, violently piercing the fragile tissues of his biological brain to establish a direct, unfiltered conduit. As the incredibly dense data streams of the monolithic cogitator flooded his expanding consciousness, the paralyzing agony of his infallible memory was forcibly, violently overwritten by absolute binary logic. His weeping, human eyes were carefully extracted and replaced by the unblinking, glowing, synthetic gaze of the targeting apparatus, and the flawed, suffering mortal man known as Malakai simply ceased to exist. In his place, a new, flawless entity ascended into the digital, omniscient heavens of the Iron-Ridge network. He became the Ghost General, an immortal, incorporeal architect of absolute defense. For 10,000 solar cycles, the Ghost General reigned over the Iron Ridge. The physical reality of the sector was fundamentally and irrevocably transformed under his absolute, soulless jurisdiction. The toxic, corrosive rains still cascaded from the permanently choked heavens, but they no longer fell upon the fragile, weeping organic chassis. Instead, the acidic downpours washed over the unyielding, rusted carapaces of millions of synchronized automata. The biological tide of the xenos swarm was now met with a defensive paradigm of terrifying mathematical perfection. The Ghost General predicted their organic movements with omniscient, chilling precision. Massive, subterranean LAS batteries and orbital plasma arrays fired in a flawless, ceaseless rhythm, vaporizing the biological entities before their immense shadows could even brush against the metal crust. The era of the Crimson Toll, the age of weeping and sacrifice, had permanently concluded. The grand paradox of his existence had been definitively solved. Yet, the metaphysical price of this eternal security was the total, systematic unmaking of the very essence the Citadel was originally built to protect. The Ghost General had successfully built an eternal sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary entirely devoid of worshippers, a colossal, empty metallic reliquary drifting endlessly through the indifferent, freezing void. He had become a leviathan of logic, sanctifying the void through the systematic, unquestioning destruction of anything that introduced a variable into his perfect equations. The tragedy of Strategos Malakai was complete. He had won every battle. He had secured the eternal survival of the territory, but he had entirely lost the war for his own soul. Thus, the cosmic theater plays out its final act. When the final campaign is won and the universe falls completely, terrifyingly silent, will there be anyone left with the capacity to appreciate the peace? If you possess the strength to gaze into the howling abyss without surrendering the fragile reliquary of your mortal coil, etch your presence into our chronicles by subscribing. Declare your allegiance in the comments below, for the silent gods are always watching.